Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode returns to the book review format, specifically concerning a book about theory in archaeology. Here I will summarize what I want to see in a book about theory in archaeology, and I will apply this information toward evaluating one of the more popular books in this field. I will look at this book, Archaeological Theory Today, edited by Ian Hodder and so far printed in 2 editions of 2001 and 2012. First, though, I want to provide general information about theory in archaeology. During the course of this presentation, you will notice several points that can be applied in any book review about theory in archaeology. In a classical sense of philosophy of science, theory involves the intellectual activity of generating notions and concepts about how and why the world operates. These notions and concepts provide the supporting framework for formulating different hypotheses that ideally can be tested with real evidence toward proving, disproving, or refining the proposed hypotheses. The evidence for testing a hypothesis can be gathered through simple procedures of techniques. In archaeology, the techniques rely on indisputable laws of physics and geology. For example, when observing pieces of material artifacts inside measurable geological layers. In order to link the data-gathering techniques with the theoretical hypotheses, method often is most crucial in the scientific thought process. In this regard, method involves the application of analytical and interpretive procedures, specifically applied to the primary datasets in a manner that can address a hypothesis. In a separate video, I presented more details about the relations among theory, method, and technique in archaeology. For now, in this current video, I want to stress that theory is one part of the scientific thought process. In this view, theory alone is incomplete. A theory can become viable only in coordination with technique and method. In this sense, any book about theory will face practical problems about how to present theory in an accurate and meaningful way. A book about theory in archaeology or in any field of study necessarily would be abstract and vague unless the theory can be applied with real examples through the use of technique and method. Accordingly, most books about theory deliberately mention these issues. The real-life examples tend to be minimal in any book about theory, but at least the book can offer enough information for readers to consider how to apply a theory with technique and method. This aspect was handled unevenly in the different chapters written by separate authors of the book Archaeological Theory Today. For practical reasons, any discussion of theory needs to recognize the relations with technique and theory, but the scope and definition of a theory should be clarified in its own terms. In my view, this clarification needs to be established right away, preferably in an introductory chapter of a book about theory. Awkwardly, this clarification is missing in the introductory chapter of Archaeological Theory Today, and readers would need to look elsewhere for this information. Often, in everyday language, people use the word theory rather loosely without clearly distinguishing a theory from a hypothesis, a philosophical perspective, or sometimes a methodological approach. In daily conventional speech, a hypothesis may be presented as if it were synonymous with a theory. In reality, a theory can generate multiple hypotheses. Moreover, whenever a hypothesis is tested through technique and method, then the results feed back to refine the theory. Ideally, the refined theory next can generate revised hypotheses toward continuing the scientific thought process. In the book Archaeological Theory Today, none of the contributing chapters portray a hypothesis as if it were a theory. Nonetheless, general readers may not be aware of this distinction. For people who want to read a book about different hypotheses in archaeology, this book would be terribly disappointing and befuddling. As I mentioned, this book does not clarify what theory is in the first place. Only some of the chapters in this book present different theories, while other chapters present philosophical perspectives or methodological approaches. A philosophical perspective, or a school of thought, potentially can establish logical parameters and themes that can be addressed through a body of theory. For example, postmodernism is a perspective that doubts, or in some cases denies, the ability of human beings to know anything for certain. In this perspective of postmodernism, most scientific questions cannot be addressed with evidence because the evidence itself would be rejected as inherently biased and misleading. This perspective could be applied in any field of study, and therefore it could interface with many theories in archaeology as well as in other disciplines. The postmodernism perspective has influenced numerous scholars, including the editor of this book, Ian Hodder, and the authors of some of the chapters in this book. Accordingly, many parts of this book present philosophical perspectives as if they were theories. This problem most easily could have been addressed by clarifying the terminology in the introductory chapter of the book. Without this clarification, several parts of this book were misleading. This deficiency was retained and expanded in the second edition of this book. The introductory chapter and many of the internal chapters of this book do not differentiate between a philosophical perspective and a theory. When I read these chapters, then I can apply this distinction on my own, and I can identify how a philosophical perspective may or may not support a possible theory or set of theories. I should emphasize that philosophical perspectives can be productive toward developing theories, and they should be included in a book about theory. Nonetheless, I would want to see more clarity of the scientific thought process. Furthermore, regarding the scientific thought process, methodology is essential for linking between primary data gathering techniques and intellectual theories. In this sense, any book about theory would need to refer to methodological approaches. In the book Archaeological Theory Today, one chapter in particular concentrates on the methodological approaches that operate within the general utility perspective of behavioral archaeology. This chapter clarifies the logical thought structure and process quite effectively and thoroughly, yet these clarifications are absent in the rest of the book. Now, with this general information about theory and related issues in archaeology, I would like to consider more about the contents of this rather influential book, Archaeological Theory Today. The first edition of this book was published in 2001, and the second edition appeared in 2012. Just looking at the tables of contents of the two editions, you will notice that the second edition retained most of the original chapters. Very few of the chapters were modified or deleted, and a few new chapters were added. Of course, most people would prefer to read the most updated versions of the chapters in the second edition. Only in one case would I suggest to look at the first edition version of a chapter, namely involving the chapter about behavioral archaeology. The original first edition was written more clearly and coherently, most likely due to the role of Michael Schiffer as a co-author of this chapter in the first edition, but not in the second edition. Michael Schiffer was at the forefront of this perspective or school of thought of behavioral archaeology since its beginnings in the early 1970s. In particular, he was involved in developing the methodological approaches that could be applied not only in behavioral archaeology, but rather in a larger discipline of archaeology in the most general sense. All of the chapters in this book were written by different authors who could represent the diversity of thoughts, perspectives, and opinions related with theory in archaeology. This format was successful for representing each viewpoint accurately in its own terms. Unfortunately, though, each chapter was written in its own style and followed a different structure of presentation. I would have expected for the editor of this book to apply a few simple measures for making the chapters consistent and comparable with one another. For example, as an editor, I would insist for each chapter to begin with a concise definition of the theory or perspective at hand. Even in the second edition of the book, some of the chapters never bothered to give a definition of their topic. The most frustrating example was in the second edition chapter about symmetrical archaeology. For readers who do not already know about symmetrical archaeology, this chapter would be virtually meaningless. I would have liked to see a simple definition in the beginning of each chapter. This information could be conveyed in just a few words in an abstract or synopsis, in a highlighted sidebar, or in the text of the opening paragraph. Alternatively, an introductory chapter could have clarified the topics of each internal chapter of the book. In this book, though, the editor Ian Hodder followed a different format in the introductory chapter. Ian Hodder shared his views about how the discipline of archaeology developed over the last several decades, with attention to some issues related with theory. Unfortunately, as I had mentioned earlier in this video, Ian Hodder did not offer a definition of theory in archaeology. Instead, he referred to a few of the philosophical perspectives that were influential for himself in his own career. In my view, the information here is incomplete, biased, and misleading. I would recommend to ignore this chapter and instead find another reference that outlines the logical thought structure of archaeology with attention to the role of theory. In the second edition of this book, Ian Hodder added a summary graphic to illustrate how all of the internal chapters intellectually were linked with one another, and with the only 3 philosophical perspectives that he could recognize. I regard this graphic as mostly useless. Nevertheless, I appreciate the idea of this summary graphic. I could imagine students making their own versions of this graphic, accompanied by a formal essay. Such an assignment, though, would require several formal courses and extensive reading lists beyond simply reading this one book of archaeological theory today. For basic coursework about theory in archaeology, I found this book overall to be useful for students to learn about diverse perspectives and ideas. Moreover, students could read the chapters written by the leading experts in each topic. In most cases, I would recommend to read the second edition for its more updated content. Whether or not you agree with one or another perspective, you still could read the contents in the words of their own practitioners. In my opinion, this book on its own is inadequate for representing theory in archaeology. In this regard, I recommend to make 4 simple additions. First, before even reading this book, I would start with a concise journal article or other reference that defines the interrelated roles of theory, method, and technique in archaeology. Second, I would add a few brief readings to augment each chapter, for instance, using the key original references that the authors had written or used in order to compose their summary chapters. Third, in a classroom setting, I would encourage a simple writing assignment for each chapter, identifying the scope and definition of the chapter and the role of theory in each case. Fourth, another classroom assignment can identify the potential for using real archaeological data with whatever theory, perspective, or methodology is being proposed. In concluding this episode, now you should be familiar with some of the major issues and concerns for reading, writing, and evaluating a book about theory in archaeology. Many books have been published, and others will continue to be published about theory in archaeology, far beyond the content that I have reviewed in this video. Please remember to subscribe to this channel, share with your friends, and explore more online videos with the Archaeology Studio.